Your ancestor bites into a red berry, and within an hour, they're dead. Their child watches, memorizes the shape of that plant, the color of that berry, the smell of the leaves, and never touches it again. This single, brutal lesson, passed from one trembling memory to the next, is how the earliest humans built their entire understanding of what was safe to eat and what could kill them in minutes. Picture a small band of people moving through dense forest tens of thousands of years ago. There's no supermarket, no label listing calories or allergens, no internet to search, "Is this mushroom poisonous?" There's only their senses, their memories, and the accumulated knowledge of everyone who came before them. Every single day was a quiet gamble with survival, and the stakes could not have been higher. The first and most brutal method our ancestors relied on was trial and error. Someone, at some point in deep prehistory, had to be the first person to eat a completely unfamiliar plant, root, or berry. Sometimes it went fine, sometimes it didn't. Entire groups of early humans developed their food knowledge through this slow, dangerous process, testing plants generation after generation, and the ones who survived to pass on what they learned shaped the next chapter of human history. This is the harsh reality behind so many of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables we eat casually today. Someone, thousands of years ago, paid a terrible price to discover they were edible. If you find that as unsettling as we do, make sure you're subscribed, because the story only gets stranger from here, and Prehistoric People is just getting started uncovering how our ancestors really survived. But humans weren't purely reckless gamblers. Over time, they developed a set of sensory tools that dramatically improved their odds. Smell was one of the earliest warning systems. A rotten, sulfurous, or bitter odor coming from meat or plants signaled danger long before any modern chemistry existed to explain why. Our ancestors' noses were finely tuned instruments, capable of detecting the subtle shift between "this will nourish me" and "this will kill me." Taste worked the same way. Extreme bitterness, a chemical sharpness on the tongue, or an unnatural numbing sensation were the body's own alarm bells. In fact, many toxic plants naturally taste intensely bitter or acrid, specifically because that bitterness comes from the same defensive compounds that make them poisonous. Early humans who paid close attention to these sensations and who trusted that instinctive recoil were the ones who lived long enough to raise children and teach them the same caution. Texture and appearance mattered too. Discoloration, unusual sliminess, or a strange dullness in animal flesh often meant decay or disease. Certain mushrooms with vivid, almost unnatural colors were treated with deep suspicion, an instinct that, remarkably, lines up with what we now know scientifically. Many of the most poisonous fungi really do display bright warning colors, a natural signal evolved over millions of years. Our ancestors couldn't explain the biochemistry, but they didn't need to. They needed only to notice the pattern and respect it. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Early humans weren't figuring this out entirely on their own. They were watching the animals around them, and animals turned out to be walking, breathing guides to what was safe. If birds ate a particular berry and thrived, that was valuable information. If a herd of grazing animals consistently avoided a specific plant, generation after generation, that avoidance was itself a kind of ancient warning label. Prehistoric communities that lived closely alongside wildlife learned to read these behavioral cues as part of their survival toolkit, essentially outsourcing some of the riskiest experimentation to species that had been testing the local plant life for far longer than humans had even existed in that region. This is also where a strange irony emerges. Just because an animal could safely eat something didn't mean a human could do the same. Some creatures have digestive systems built to neutralize toxins that would devastate a human body. So while animal behavior offered a useful starting clue, it was never a perfect guarantee, and the humans who survived best were the ones who combined animal observation with their own direct testing, using extreme caution, usually starting with only the smallest possible taste. If you've made it this far, you're clearly as fascinated by this as we are, so drop a comment and tell us, would you have had the courage to be the first person in your tribe to try an unknown plant, knowing what was at stake? We read every single one, and it's genuinely wild to see how differently people imagine themselves in that situation. As human groups grew larger and more organized, something remarkable happened. Knowledge stopped being something each person had to rediscover alone through painful trial and error. It became collective. Once a group figured out that a certain root was deadly unless boiled for a specific length of time, or that a particular berry was safe only when fully ripened, that information didn't die with the person who learned it. It was remembered, repeated, and passed down. This is one of the most underrated superpowers of early human society. Our ancestors' greatest survival tool wasn't strength or speed. It was the ability to share what one person learned with an entire community and then with the next generation after that. Oral tradition became the database of prehistoric humanity. Stories, warnings, and food rules were woven into the daily rhythm of life, repeated so often that they became second nature. A parent teaching a child which mushrooms to avoid wasn't just passing along a fact. They were passing along the accumulated experience of possibly dozens of generations before them, condensed into a simple, memorable rule. Some anthropologists studying modern-day hunter-gatherer societies have found that this kind of food knowledge is often wrapped in ritual, taboo, or storytelling, specifically because those formats make information easier to remember and harder to forget. A frightening story about a person who died from eating the wrong plant sticks in a child's mind far more powerfully than a simple instruction ever could. And then came a discovery that changed absolutely everything about what our ancestors could safely eat: fire. Before humans learned to cook consistently, huge portions of the natural world were simply off limits, either too toxic, too difficult to digest, or too dangerous with parasites and bacteria. Cooking changed the entire equation. Heat breaks down many natural toxins found in roots, tubers, and certain plants, turning foods that were once dangerous or even lethal in their raw state into safe, reliable sources of nutrition. Cassava is one striking example still relevant today. In its raw form, certain varieties contain compounds that release cyanide, yet through cooking and specific preparation methods refined over generations, it becomes a staple food eaten safely by millions of people. Fire didn't just add flavor to prehistoric life. It unlocked entire categories of food that would have otherwise remained dangerous or completely inedible, and it also killed off dangerous bacteria and parasites lurking in raw meat, dramatically reducing the risk of deadly infections. This single innovation likely expanded the diet of early humans more than almost anything else in our evolutionary story. Communities who mastered fire-based food preparation had access to a wider, more reliable, and more nutritious range of food than those who didn't, and that advantage rippled outward into every part of survival, from physical health to brain development, since a more stable and nutrient-rich diet is believed by many researchers to have supported the growth of larger, more energy-hungry brains over time. Geography added yet another fascinating layer to this story. The food knowledge of early humans in a dense tropical rainforest looked completely different from the knowledge held by people living on a windswept coastal plain, or in an arid grassland, or in a frozen northern landscape. Each environment came with its own unique dangers and its own unique opportunities. Coastal groups developed deep expertise in shellfish, learning which ones were safe during particular seasons and which could carry dangerous toxins during algae blooms, a danger that, remarkably, still exists today and still requires careful seasonal awareness. Inland groups focused their knowledge on roots, nuts, and berries specific to their local plant life. Arctic and subarctic peoples developed extraordinary knowledge of preserving and safely eating fermented fish and meat, techniques that might sound strange to modern ears, but that provided crucial nutrition, including vitamins otherwise scarce in their environment, through long, harsh winters. This means there was never one single cheat sheet for prehistoric food safety. It was thousands of localized, hard-won bodies of knowledge, each one perfectly adapted to its specific environment, each one representing generations of careful observation, testing, and refinement. A person raised in one environment dropped suddenly into a completely different one would have been almost as vulnerable as a total beginner, despite being a skilled and experienced forager in their own homeland. Teaching children this knowledge wasn't a casual, occasional thing. It was one of the most serious responsibilities in prehistoric society. Children would have learned by watching, by helping gather food alongside adults, by hearing the same warnings repeated over and over until they became instinctive. Mistakes in this area weren't just embarrassing, they could be fatal. So the teaching had to be thorough, consistent, and deeply reinforced, likely starting from a very young age and continuing well into adolescence. In many ways, learning what was safe to eat was as fundamental to prehistoric education as learning to read and write is to children today, and arguably far more urgent, since getting it wrong could end a young life almost immediately. Distinguishing toxic species from their edible lookalikes required an extraordinarily refined eye, something that could only be built through years of hands-on experience and careful instruction. Many of the most dangerous plants and fungi in the world have close relatives, or even nearly identical twins, that are perfectly safe and nutritious. Certain wild mushrooms look almost indistinguishable from deadly poisonous varieties, differing only in small details, like the color of their spores or a subtle ring pattern on the stem. Early humans who lived in a particular area for generations developed an intimate, detailed familiarity with these differences, essentially building a mental field guide passed down and refined through direct experience long before anything was ever written down. This is precisely why moving into unfamiliar territory was so genuinely dangerous for prehistoric people. It wasn't just about facing unfamiliar predators or a harsher climate. It meant encountering an entirely new set of plants and fungi with no inherited knowledge to fall back on. Groups migrating into new regions had to essentially restart this entire learning process, likely relying heavily on trial and error once again, or on careful, cautious observation of local animals and, when possible, learning from other human groups already living in that area. Preservation techniques became another crucial layer of food safety, one that's honestly easy to overlook today. Knowing a food was safe to eat fresh was only half the challenge. Prehistoric people also had to figure out how to keep food edible over time without it becoming dangerous. Drying, smoking, and fermentation all emerged as ways to extend the life of food while often actually making it safer, not less safe. Fermentation in particular is a fascinating case because the process can create an environment where harmful bacteria struggle to survive, while beneficial microorganisms thrive and even add nutritional value. Our ancestors didn't understand microbiology, obviously, but they understood outcomes. They noticed which preservation methods worked and which methods led to sickness, and they refined their practices accordingly across countless generations of careful, patient trial and observation. What's genuinely remarkable, and honestly a little humbling, is that so much of this ancient knowledge hasn't disappeared. It survives today, quietly embedded in indigenous communities around the world who still carry forward traditional food practices refined over an almost unimaginable span of time. Anthropologists and botanists studying these communities have repeatedly found layers of sophisticated understanding about local plants, safe preparation methods, and seasonal risks that in some cases go far beyond what modern science had documented before these encounters. This isn't some distant, purely historical curiosity locked away in the past. It's living knowledge, still actively practiced, still being passed down exactly the way it always was, from one generation directly to the next. So the next time you eat something as simple as a properly cooked kidney bean, or a piece of cassava bread, or even a jar of pickled vegetables, it's worth pausing for just a moment to consider the staggering, largely invisible chain of human trial, error, close observation, and hard-earned wisdom that made it possible for that food to be sitting safely on your plate today. Every single rule about food safety that feels completely obvious to us now was, at some point in the deep past, a genuinely dangerous discovery, often paid for at real and painful cost. If this look into how our ancestors mastered survival hit different for you, hit subscribe right now, because next time on Prehistoric People, we're diving into something even more unsettling. What actually happened when disease and plague tore through prehistoric communities who had absolutely no concept of germs, no medicine, and no idea why people around them were dying? It's a story of fear, of desperate improvised solutions, and of a kind of resilience that's honestly hard to fully wrap your head around. You will not want to miss it.